Ash Regan, thank you so much for coming into the studio today. You're a member of the Scottish Parliament. You were a cabinet minister. You resigned over that controversial gender recognition bill. But now you've brought forward a bill in the Scottish Parliament to change the law on prostitution. Now, before we get into the detail of the bill, can you tell me what's led you to talk about this issue, to be interested in this issue?
Yes, so I suppose I probably came to public prominence during the fact that I resigned from Nicola Sturgeon's government and received quite a snippy letter back from my service. So I guess I would be probably considered to be somebody who's quite well known in Scotland, particularly for standing up for women and children. So this, I feel, is really an extension of the things that I'm passionate about in politics. And I have been working on the issue of prostitution for many years now. And in fact, the last person to bring this into the Scottish Parliament was a Labour member. And I actually volunteered in her team when she was trying to do this. And that was, we think that was about 13 years ago now. So I've been working on it for a very long time. I've spoken to many women and some men who have worked in prostitution. So I think I'm fairly well familiar with the arguments and so on. And I was actually going to try and do it when I was part of the government. So I used to be the community safety minister, and prostitution was part of that part of government. And at the point where I left government, which was in 2022, this bill, or a bill very similar to this, was slated to be a government bill in probably year 4 of the Parliament, which is roughly about where we are now. And the Scottish Parliament's coming up for elections again next year.
So what's the current law on prostitution in Scotland, and why do you think it needs to change?
So it's very similar probably to England. So we do have laws around curb crawling, which will probably be familiar to many people. I guess that's really based on what prostitution used to be like. People who are a bit older will remember that. There are also laws against brothel keeping for obvious reasons. But you can actually be criminalised for selling sex. So most of the people that sell sex are female. It's 96% of the sellers are women, sometimes very young as well, sometimes children. And so my idea is you change that around and you shift the balance of the criminality onto the men. So the buyers are men, like 99% of them are men, or perhaps even higher than that. And the idea is that you shift the shame and the criminality where it belongs onto the buyer, because it is the buyers that are driving the market. So if you think of prostitution as a system and a market in which young women and girls really are exploited, it's very violent. It also leads to sex trafficking. It's that's drawing them in. So if the market of prostitution wasn't as big as it is, it wouldn't lead to so many trafficking victims being brought into your country. So if you can shrink the market of prostitution down, less people are going to be harmed, because obviously it's very dangerous and harmful. And then it will also reduce the trafficking inflows into the country. And it's been done in lots of other places. So Ireland has done it, France, Canada, and the Nordic countries. So it's quite a normal approach, although countries do seem quite split. They either tend to go for this approach or they go for the complete opposite approach, which is often called decriminalization or regulation.
Which a country like Germany, for example, or the Netherlands have, where prostitution is completely legal, it's regulated, and actually prostitutes have to pay tax on their earning and the government takes that money. Why would you not go for that model?
I can see why politicians perhaps at the time in both those countries thought that this might be a good... It sounds like it might work, allows people to maybe be in a union or to have some sort of legal protections. But in reality, it doesn't work. So both in the Netherlands and in Germany, which have slightly different models. So Germany did start off with decriminalisation in 2002. They quickly realised that this wasn't working and they moved to slightly more of a regulatory model. But in essence, they're quite similar. What happens is that the market of prostitution then grows rapidly. So the figures that we have for that is we think the prostitution market, or the number of people that are in prostitution in Germany, doubled. So it's gone from something like 200,000 to 400,000. So that is a huge number. And actually what's happened is that most people who work in prostitution in Germany are not, they don't have licenses, they're not regulated in any way, and most of them are trafficked. So it's gone from being mostly German women that were working in prostitution to now mostly trafficked women. And the murder statistics are absolutely terrible. So from around about 2002, something like that, up until about 2020, there's been nearly 100 women who work in prostitution who've been murdered by pimps and punters in Germany. By contrast, in Sweden, which is where the model that I'm suggesting has come from, and it's often called the Nordic model, no women who work in prostitution have been murdered in Sweden since they changed the law in 1999.
Now, some people who oppose your bill would say that sex work is like any other work. If women choose to engage in prostitution, why should they not be allowed to do this? Why shouldn't the sex be allowed to be sold as any other commodity? What do you say to that?
Well, under the set of laws that I'm proposing, they would be able to continue to sell sex if that's what they wanted to do, and they themselves would be decriminalised, because at the moment, women selling sex can still be criminalised. In practice, in Scotland, the Scottish police don't do that. They, I think, agree with the conceptualisation that most people would have now, is that many of the people that are involved in selling sex are victims. The typical profile we see often is girls that have been through the care system, and that will have resonance, I think, for people who've looked at the Asian grooming gangs scandal. They have been subject to quite often to sexual violence in the home as children, or come from very chaotic backgrounds. So I think the idea that for many people this is a choice that they freely go into, that is generally not what we see. And Melissa Farley, so she's one of the leading researchers on prostitution, and she put the figures at about 2%. So the rest of them are the ones I've described who've come from very backgrounds where I think they wouldn't feel they had much of an option, and the rest are trafficking victims. So about 60% of those in prostitution we now think have been trafficked. Now, for people that don't understand what that might be like, these women often have their documents taken away from them, so they are surveilled nearly the entire time. And there was one study, so Reem Al-Salem, so she's the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, and she wrote a very interesting paper where she was talking about the tactics that these pimps use against the women that they are obviously exploiting in prostitution and making a huge amount of money from. That they will surveil them the whole time. There's intermittent violence, sometimes rewards, and explaining that is very similar to what you would see in a state of torture. So she was saying that pimps are the biggest distributors of torture. And when you think about it like that, these women, when they come out the other end, because obviously many times they will become too old and then they won't be able to do that anymore. They mostly have complex PTSD, so they're in a state where they're obviously highly traumatized, and it can take a long time, if ever, to recover your life and to kind of move on from that level of trauma.
So if your bill is successful, that will allow the authorities to criminalise, to potentially fine and jail men who are caught either paying for sex or pimping out these women who've been trafficked. But does the bill have enough support in Parliament? Is it likely to become law?
I think that really what we're trying to do with the bill is I'm not trying to criminalise loads of people. That's not really the intention with this, although, the courts can impose that punishment if they want, so it can lead to 1 year time in prison. We anticipate that most people who will be convicted of this will end up with a fine of some level, depending on which level of the court they go to. The idea behind it is to create that deterrent effect, much like we see with other types of legislation. I think many people will remember driving in cars, you didn't used to have to wear a seatbelt, then they changed the law. But had they not have said that if we catch you, you will get into trouble if you're not wearing a seatbelt, people wouldn't have bothered to abide by the law. You need to have that deterrent effect. So we want to deter men from buying sex because it is inherently exploitative, and become a society, I think, where we agree that this is exploitation, that it's not something we want to be doing as a society, because I think it's beneficial both for men and for women in society when women are perceived more equally and, this type of thing isn't going on. But yes, I have got a challenge ahead of me, that's for sure. I won't sugarcoat it. I have had a number of people telling me that they will support the bill. And it's really a matter, I think, of we're just at the beginning of stage one. We've got 3 stages to go through. Making that argument in the committee, making that argument in the chamber, talking to colleagues, and hopefully I will get support. But I would say anybody that is serious about combating violence against women and girls, this is an excellent place to start. It is, most people would agree that prostitution is violence against women.
Yeah.
From what I've seen, from the people that I've spoken to, the survivors that have been through prostitution, that is the way they would explain it to you. They would say to you that it's being raped by strangers for money. And this is not a normal job. This is not work. This is exploitation, very clearly. And so, to my mind, this is an absolute no-brainer. If you care about women and girls, you want to live in a more equal society, and you want to combat men's violence against women, this is a great place to start.
Now, you came to prominence fighting the gender recognition bill in Scotland, standing up very bravely and saying, men cannot become women. We need to protect women from men who claim to be women and want to use women's services. Now, that was a very courageous thing to do. That was not the mainstream view in the SNP, although it is the mainstream view in the public. Are there any crossovers, do you think, between that battle over gender ideology and this very different battle, but nevertheless has similarities over protecting women and girls?
I think there is. I have often observed that some of the people that were arguing trans rights activists, I guess you would call them, that many of them seem to be very pro-prostitution. And I think maybe it comes back to this idea about women's dignity, women's safety, women's boundaries. And I think once you get used to crossing them all the time and not listening to what women are telling you, then perhaps those two things go hand in hand. But I'm very clear that this is exploitation, it is violence against women. To be honest, I can't understand why the Scottish Parliament hasn't done this before. It seems very simple. My bill it's very straightforward. It's only actually 4.5 pages long. So it has the sort of 4 pillars. So it's the criminalising the purchase of sex, decriminalising the sale of sex. I also want to nullify any convictions that people have had from prostitution. So if you've been selling sex and you've received a conviction for that, I want to quash those convictions and also offer people a right to support. So if you've ever worked in prostitution in Scotland, you would then have a right to support to get your life back, to rebuild your life. So I think it seems like a great option. I really hope that I'll get the support in Parliament.
Ash Regan, MSP, thank you so much for talking to me today and all the best.
Thank you.